Hey, good people. Grits or cream of wheat? Who the hell is racist? Does anyone ever ask if they touch your hair?
Black Like Me.
You're listening to Black Like Me with Dr. Alex G., a podcast that invites you to experience the world through the perspective of one black man, one conversation, one story, or even one rant at a time. Here's Dr. G.
Black Like Me.
Hey, good people. Welcome back to another exciting episode of Black Like Me with Dr. Alex G. So listen, there's so many things that's going on in my head right now about what's happening in this country. I'm in Wisconsin. We're having struggles with how voting is worked out in places like Milwaukee. We're wrestling with issues of criminal justice. We're finding that folks who are incarcerated have COVID-19. And we're trying to figure out where are the acts of humanity, where's the outcry around these issues of folks who have not committed criminal violent acts, why they can't be released into some other kinds of space, facility, or home, or to the community so that they're not just sitting ducks waiting to be infected. There's so much that's going on. But today I want to talk about criminal justice reform. I want to talk about what it means to be tough and hard on crime, scare tactics that's being used by current administrations. And I want to talk with folks, two gentlemen who are colleagues of mine, and we want to have just a real interesting conversation about this. Listen, you do not want to miss this, so sit up, listen, because this is going to be really, really eye-opening. So the two gentlemen who are appearing on Black Like Me today is one who's no stranger to Black Like Me, is Mr. Jerome Dillard. My interview with him when this podcast first started still remains like one of the top 2 or 3 downloaded episodes in my 4-season history. He is the founding executive director of Expo, ex-incarcerated people organizing. It's a statewide organization that's mobilizing on behalf of folks who are incarcerated and who are reentering our community. And he's moving to change laws and thought processes and the new reality for these individuals. He's been doing this for a number of years, and I met Jerome years ago when he was just being released from prison, and it is because of him and his mentorship that I've been enlightened, and I am also committed to the work of really looking into the rights of people who have been incarcerated. In fact, I'm a proud board member of Expo. Mr. Dillard asked me to do that recently, so I'm very excited about that. You'll hear from him in just a moment. And my other guest is Mr. John Vaudreuil. And John is the former U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Wisconsin. He actually was appointed by President Barack Obama, and he served from August 2017 until August of 2010 to March of 2017. In just a minute, we're going to find out like what a U.S. Attorney does. But let me just welcome them. I want to tell you how we're working together, and then we'll get into some more intriguing dialogue. So, Mr. Dillard, Mr. Vaudreuil, thank you both for being here on the show today. Jerome and John, thank you for being on the show today.
There you go.
Thanks so much.
It's good to be here.
Hey, just first of all, Jerome, can you just give us just a brief, like 15, 20-second overview of the work of Expo? I'm going to also put a link in this so that the folks who are listening will be able to click and find out about your work, perhaps consider supporting your work, and certainly following what you're doing. Just a little overview of what Expo does here in Wisconsin and abroad.
Well, Expo is a organizing advocacy organization built by and for individuals who are criminal justice impacted. We're a statewide organization and actually connected to a national organization called Formerly Incarcerated Convicted People and Family Movement, which is national organizations of individuals who have been criminal justice involved.
Got you. So it's fair to say, man, you are putting your lived experience to work. So many people will have an experience with the criminal justice system and never look over their shoulders. You have certainly turned your experiences into an opportunity to shed light on the rules and laws concerning mass incarceration, as well as aiding individuals and their families who have been deeply impacted by mass incarceration. And that's great work. That's great work.
Yeah, and I'd like to talk about that a little more later in the show, how I came upon this work and why I do what I do.
Sure. We'll definitely come back to that. John, welcome to the show. This is your first time on Black Like Me, but it's so great having you here. How are you doing today?
Just fine, just fine. As they always say, long-time listener, glad to be on board now.
and John, you and your family, I hope that you're being safe and taking care of yourselves. You look well.
Walking, biking, reading. It's, if you take it that way, it's not too bad.
Sure. John, what the heck is a U.S. attorney? I mean, that sounds sexy as hell. And so, I mean, is it an elected official? I mean, like a district attorney is an elected official, but is a U.S. attorney elected?
No, U.S. attorneys, the country is divided into 94 districts from Maine to Guam.
Okay.
And to cover those districts with federal prosecutors, there's a head of each office. So there's 93 U.S. attorneys. I'm always amazed with 300 million people that somehow I was one of these small group of 93. So each U.S. attorney is the lead federal law enforcement officer for that district. It might be the Southern District of New York with thousands of lawyers just covering Manhattan. It might be, as I was, U.S. attorney for the western 44 counties, the western 2/3 of Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. So I'm the lead federal law enforcement officer for federal cases in that district.
Got you. How many federal, how many U.S. Attorneys does this, like a state of Wisconsin, have?
2 in Wisconsin. We have 2 districts. The 28 states to the east are with the U.S. attorney in Milwaukee, and the 44 counties to the west, drawn by Congress hundreds of years ago, is the Western District. And each state, Minnesota has 1 U.S. attorney, Chicago has 3. It's just a quirk of history when these districts were drawn back in the 1800s, most of them.
Sure. Thank you for that background. And you started as a federal prosecutor right out of law school. Like in 1980, you said you basically walked. I think you graduated from University of Wisconsin Law School, University of Wisconsin-Madison Law School, and became a federal prosecutor right out of law school. I mean,
I was very fortunate. As I like to say, I'm a proud double badger. I went to undergrad in law school. I was hired as what's called an assistant U.S. attorney. Those positions are hired, and then you have essentially, you can be removed for cause, but it's a real job with some protection. Because what people should know is, well, the U.S. attorneys change with the president. You were appointed by the president, which is why I left in March of 2017. As is his right, President Trump replaced all the U.S. attorneys with people he appointed. But the assistant U.S. attorneys, who actually do the real work, who prosecute the cases and go to court, they stay the same, so there's consistency, hopefully, whereas the leadership, and this is the way our system is for right or wrong, the leadership can try and work with policies that any president might want, and I worked from President Reagan through President Trump, lots of different approaches. While policies may change to the U.S. attorney, the assistant U.S. attorneys, which is what I was for 30 years, stay the same.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for that. So John, you were probably on the front line of first group of people who were fired by President Trump.
That is true. But no matter what I say or write now about the administration or the Department of Justice, and I've signed letters and been interviewed about having Mr. Attorney General Barr resign. No matter what I do, I always say, hey, they can't fire me again.
That's right. That's right. So I want to say to my Black Like Me listeners, I've known Mr. Dillard, as I said, for years. We've been friends for, my daughter's 23, so at least 24, 25 years. He helped me walk through her premature birth. I officiated his wedding to his beautiful wife, Teresa, and just walked through many stages of life. I'm with him. John's a newer colleague, and we really came together around this initiative of justified anger. I'll also put a link of that in Black Like Me. I don't always talk about that on the show, but I run a nonprofit. I founded it nearly 30 years ago. It's called Nehemiah. And it was really formed to build capacity and leadership development skills within African Americans so that we were able to cope in a majority white community or system. growing up in Wisconsin, growing up in Madison, I was often one or two only Black children in the classroom. As an econ major at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I sat in lectures of 600 students where I was one of 3 Black students. And so we created Nehemiah so that it would build a support system around African Americans who wanted to really succeed and move out of poverty or disenfranchisement, in accessing resources and opportunities in our community. About 6 or 7 years ago, I wrote an op-ed piece for our newspaper called Justified Anger. And it went viral, 7,000 shares. And I keep telling them, not just likes, not just thumbs up, but just 7,000 shares. And what I found is if we talk to people about building capacity in Black folks, but not change systems, then we really have not done the complete work. Some organizations build capacity, others challenge systems. Nehemiah, through his initiative, Justified Anger, does both, which makes us very fortunate. It's an arduous task, but we've got to be able to do both of them. So Jerome is an example of someone who's helped me to build the capacity of serving individuals, finding housing, employment, support groups. We even founded a support group for men who are formerly incarcerated called Man Up. With the creation of Expo, Jerome is now helping to change systemic realities concerning prison reform or mass incarceration. So that's an example of how you work on both sides of the equation. Through Justified Anger, we put together a committee. We call it a table because it's a round table, if you will, with different folks from various criminal justice backgrounds. So I tell you where I got this idea from. I was hosting a meeting once. Mr. Dillard was on the panel, and we were talking about mass incarceration, something that Nehemiah had put on. And I believe that it was our sheriff, Dave Mahoney, who said, it was someone from DOC, Department of Corrections, who basically said, you all are talking to us like we go and arrest people. We only incarcerate people that have moved through our system. You got to talk to the DA and the judges and the police, and you have to go all the way back. And I realized, I said, wait a minute, you mean these people are not all sitting in a room together? Like that group is not being convened on a regular basis for the sake of building collegiality and connection and communication and trust. So with my colleague, Dr. Karen Reese and Jerome, we put together a committee that's been meeting for about 2 years now. And John is on it. Jerome and I chair it. Our sheriff is on it. Our DA is on it, not assistant, DAs, our elected official, DA, elected judge, sheriff. There's a judge that's on it. Our state public defender is on it. Other nonprofit leaders. It's a very eclectic group.
Public health.
Yeah, it's a very eclectic group. And we've been meeting together for almost 2 years to build trust and rapport so that we can begin to collaborate together. And the Madison Police is also a part of it. So we can talk about everything from arrests to sentencing, to courts, to initial appearances, to the DA, to right up into incarceration. And we were talking about how do we collaborate together. I know that was a long background, but it's a serious perspective, a serious piece of work because that has not been done regularly by a Black-led organization. This has not been called by the U.S. Attorney's Office or the DA's office or the sheriff or public defender. Nehemiah and his Justified Anger initiative has come together to say, how do we change systems? So that's just background so we can contextualize what those two entities are. Well, after one of the initial meetings in my home, we were wrapping up the meeting. We'd ordered some dinner because I wanted to do something very different. We want to build a trust. And so many times these community meetings are held in offices. So I said, let's do this in our home. So at the very end of the meeting, Jerome and I again are chairing it. So Jerome's a leader in this context. I've never been incarcerated. Jerome has been. We're both Black men. We're friends. We're family. We're talking. And Jerome said something to the effect of, yeah, John, man, things have changed. I've come a long way since I first appeared before you. And John made some reference about sending Jerome away. And I said, wait. As my grandmother would say, hold the phone. I said, what do you mean? And I realized that for one of Jerome's stints of incarceration, John was the attorney that sent Jerome away. Shit. But here's what's getting me. Jerome is leading this meeting with me, And John is following Jerome's leadership. Now, first, let me say that. I'm going to let you gentlemen talk. This is a huge initiative of justified anger. Typically, the way things happen in this country, historically, the way it's happened even in our own state, where we have so many disparities, just listen to the show and you'll hear them. One of the things I stated in my article was that Black people have got to be at the table setting the agenda. John hasn't been in prison, so why should he run this meeting? Karen's never been in prison. Why should she run this meeting? Someone should run this meeting who knows what the inside of a prison feels like, smells like, tastes like, both state prison, jail, federal penitentiary. And but our whole thing is bring the people with lived experiences. Now, let me just stress this. I'm going to let John and Jerome talk for just a moment, but I just need to get on my soapbox for just a minute. Black Like Me family. When we talk about our lived experiences in places like Madison, the rebuttal is often, but we have evidence-based practices and we have this and we have that, to belittle the input of folks who have been the most impacted by these rules, laws, hard on drugs, tough on drugs, hard on crime. These folks don't get a chance to come to the table. So in this meeting, Jerome is leading it with me. I mean, this is like right at the end. If this were a church service, it'd be like the benediction. And they say this. I stopped, this is about 2 years ago, I took a picture and I said, Jerome, this is the epitome of the new normal, that we've got to have folks of color who have been incarcerated, who've experienced poverty, homelessness. They've got to help shape the agenda. So Jerome shapes the agenda with me for shaping or challenging or suggesting changes that the DA can do, the state public offender, sheriff, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Jerome, I'm going to shut up for a minute. I just have to say that to talk about why you helped me create this entity, this movement within Justified Anger, this criminal justice table. But while we were sitting there, you never said until the very end how you knew John. Did it just not occur to you? Did you not want to break the meeting up? Was it embarrassing? Were you pissed? Were you thinking this is the blunt that sent me away? What were you thinking sitting there chairing a meeting where, the former federal prosecutor is sitting there with his legs crossed eating lasagna with us? What were you thinking that day?
Well, Alex, it was intentional that I invited John.
You invited John.
Came together someday at some event, and I was speaking, and John, I recognized him, but I couldn't place where I knew this man from.
There's been so many prosecutors, so many courts.
And when I said my name, I believe John, it rang a bell. Now, my case was not a high profile. It was really a low level offense in the federal courts. I actually did more time on the revocation than the time that the deal that I took. John gave me a good deal.
What did he give you? What did he give you?
Well, I was sentenced to 1 year and a day and 3 years supervision.
Okay.
It was January of 87. I went to court January the 4th of 1987, which the new law, we called at the time the new law, was truth in sentencing.
Okay.
So I would say I was one of the first ones sentenced under the new law, the truth in sentencing laws,
okay,
where you do 85% of your time. I did that first bit. It wasn't that long, so I spent it in MCC Chicago.
MCC?
Metropolitan Correctional Center in Chicago, a high-rise downtown Chicago prison. And I was released, but I wind up doing 2.5 years on the revocation because my addiction.
Okay.
And I gave a couple of dirty UAs. They sent me back. Barbara Crabb, they sent me back in front of Barbara Crabb. I believe John might have been there. And I was revocated for the rest of my sentence, which was 2.5 years. I was out 6 months before revocation. I do want to say that. But that's where I really had that paradigm shift, because I actually was shipped out to a Federal Bureau of Prisons facility, which was Sandstone, Minnesota. And there I just witnessed so many young people coming in with long terms of for drug selling, or they were using the RICO Act to enhance the sentences that these individuals were getting. 18, 17, 20-year-olds coming in with 25, 30 years for drugs was appalling to me. It really upset me. And I worked in receiving. You give them their uniforms, their bed clothes, the pillowcase towels and things. So that was my job, to prepare that for intake when individuals were coming in. Doing that, I just saw so many young men, predominantly Black, coming into that institution with these huge amounts of time. And I just felt in my heart something was wrong with it. And that was the beginning on truth and sentencing, and in the midst of the new tough on crime legislations that were going forth. And I just had a paradigm shift then.
Man. So John, I'm gonna come back to you in a minute, Jerome. So John, Jerome approaches you to be a part of this team. Of course, I'm sure you remember him, but first of all, just tell me for a moment what you remember about Jerome's appearance before you. I mean, in terms of what's appropriate to share. I mean, certainly you've had hundreds of people, but you remember Jerome back in '87 appearing before you?
I cannot actually visualize my friend Jerome then, but I remember the case. All these thousands of cases, unfortunately, the details are all in my brain, and someday my head will explode, I suppose. That case, Jerome was a drug user, as he's already said, and the crime was actually a bank crime. He, as I recall it, he put a small amount of money, $100, in a bank account. Now it's open. This is back in the old days. And then he wrote a bunch of checks and he got money to fund his drug habit. So what he was actually prosecuted for was the financial crime, the bank crime. It was an FBI case. So I remember that as if it was yesterday.
Wow.
And then as Jerome understands, basically, he came back, he was revoked. And in the federal system, the prosecutor stays with the case, the new system that the Jerome's describing. It's not like the state system. These hearings are in front of the judge who sentenced you, Judge Crabb, in Jerome's case. And if I'm there that day, the prosecutor who prosecuted you goes back to court. So that was the change in the federal system, as your listeners might want to know. In 1986, the parole commission was done away with. You did not get the parole. That's the truth in sentencing. Sure. If you did something wrong, drugs or other crimes or whatnot, on release, this thing called supervised release that Jerome mentioned, you then went back before your sentencing judge and they imposed the next sentence. So anyway, I remember the case, and then frankly, it went out of my head, and lots of other cases went into my head. But I tell you a quick story. So when I become U.S. Attorney, one of the Attorney General Holder at the time and the President wanted to focus on all the aspects of prosecution, from preventing crime, if you can, to prosecution, of course, people have to be prosecuted, but also to reentry. And I realized that the two legs of that three-legged stool, as Attorney General Holder always referred to it, prevention and reentry, were things we hadn't done anything with. So I really tried to get very active in reentry. I went up to the Federal Correctional Institution at Oxford, spoke to inmate groups, spoke at graduations. I started doing stuff locally, and I may have seen Jerome, but I didn't put two and two together. And I believe at the time Jerome might have been with the Dane County Jail or Dane County as a reentry coordinator. Anyway, my next door neighbor he's actually now the guy you see on TV all the time, Dr. Ryan Westergaard. He's the head of infectious diseases for the state, a UW professor. But he's put on a one-day conference at a UW facility on Park Street about people coming out of prison and all their medical and health needs. As I remember vividly that day, maybe it was Jerome who said it, when you get out of prison, you don't have a job, and you don't have a place to live, and you don't have a family, and your friends don't talk to you, thinking of your health is like your last thing. Right. And Dr. Westergaard was trying to get us to think that way. And he'd asked me to come and I'm the U.S. attorney, and talk for a minute or two about reentry. So as Jerome says it, he stands up and he starts telling his story. And I'm almost embarrassed to say it. I audibly gasp and I go, oh my God, it's that Jerome Dillard. And I remembered him. So I went up to him, and I think your listeners will appreciate this, Reverend G. I go, Jerome, I'm John Vaudreuil, and of course he remembers me. And he says, you still owe me $100 because that $100 he put in the bank that he then defrauded the bank of a few $1,000s probably. You don't get the money back, right? So going ahead to justified anger, Alex, I was not only not surprised, I was so pleased to be invited. But from the moment we met there down at that conference in South Park Street, for a couple of years, Jerome and I would go to lunch. And we would usually meet, will be a product plug, so I won't say it. We meet a little restaurant overlooking Lake Monona. We'd have lunch, and we'd talk about what was going on. And it was one of the great connections that happened through my time. And that continues. Now I'm not as busy as I used to be. Jerome is actually really busy.
Right.
So when Jerome has time, we still go to lunch.
The relationship and the rapport is so important to me, because one of the things you taught me, Jerome, is that when we look at mass incarceration, it's a human rights issue. One of the things you said to me very early on, because I remember telling you, well, man, people shouldn't do the crime if they don't want to do the time. You said, gee, I'm not saying that there are crimes in which incarceration is the only option. Someone's raped, violent, property is destroyed. These prisons exist for certain reasons. But when they come out, most of people in prison will come out. Like, everyone is not serving a life sentence. Most people will come out. And if we don't make sure that people have a smooth reentry into the community, and if we don't humanize them by understanding their stories, it is easy to be aloof. So what this story of you two getting to know each other, you two helping to be a part of this Justified Anger team, is helping to tell the stories of men and women that we'd never know, stories we'd never hear from. Because I believe that once folks are humanized, we begin to think much differently about them. But Jerome, man, was it hard to sit down and have lunch with John? I mean, I know he was just doing his job. He was just doing, my mama was just doing her job when she spanked me, but I still was mad at her. Boss is putting you on probation, just doing their job. But man, like, what does it take inside of you, man, to sit down across the table from John, knowing you're changed and you're not the man that appeared before him in '87? How good does that feel?
Well, I realized at that time, and true enough, I had time to hash over things, my behavior, my addiction, and what it led me to. I knew John was doing his job. The fact was, I felt that, I'm a bridge builder. I believe that, we have to have those moments that we forgive and we move on. He understood I was doing my job at that time.
Yes.
And he was doing his job. The fact is, I had changed, and I just wanted to build a relationship, really. That's how we could get things done. In building that relationship, John connected me with the director of the Oxford Correctional Facility here in the state, and I was called in to be a keynote speaker.
Wow.
That's years later, but I was called in to be a keynote speaker at a graduation. I believe you set that up for me, John.
Yep.
And what I witnessed, and this was in 2012, 13, 14, somewhere up in there. What I witnessed when the graduates walked out in their caps and gowns, how many young men were in that graduation class, and young African-American men. The class was about 45, 40. It was a pretty big class.
Right.
And because they put them all together, and it just gave me an insight that nothing's really changed in this system. I was in 30 years ago, and this is what I witnessed. And here I am today in this federal prison, witnessing these young men, I met one coming out. He was being released, him and his girlfriend. I took a picture of them and had a brief conversation with him before I walked into the prison. And it just amazed me how after the graduation we had snacks and all these young cats gathered around me because my lived experience and I guess my talk with them. And I began to ask, how much time are you doing? How much time? And many of them had been in for 10 years, 15 years for drugs. So I realized that nothing's changed in all this time from 87 to here I am in 2014 and still witnessing the same thing. And so it just lit a fire under me to really do the work that I'm doing today.
You know, Mr. Dillard, you have said to me, and you're doing great work, you said to me that you remember when jobs started leaving Chicago. Mm-hmm. And you saw folks who've been gainfully employed, insured, Black families doing well, and you saw the influx of drugs into the community, and you saw Black families destroyed because people were going into jail. They were depressed, and they were using drugs and getting involved in other illicit acts. But while people were gainfully employed, while they had insurance, those things were not the reality. That's true. But something that you said to me that has actually haunted me. You talked about men being in prison during their childbearing years. You often hear that terminology associated with women. You don't really hear that with men. We can't grow the Black community without Black men. We can't have Black babies without Black men. And so the point that so many of these young men were being incarcerated when they could have and should have been having children, raising children, nurturing children, that just took a toll on our community that we're still reeling from. And everyone's acting like today's issues started today, but you can remember these as a young man on Chicago's South Side, back in the 60s, watching this turning tide that we're still wrestling with today.
Well, not only these young men, but the war on drugs swept the hundreds of thousands of uncles, fathers, big brothers, community leaders, grandfathers swept off the streets. All of a sudden, they're gone. And so what was passed on to me through my grandfather and through men in the community, it all of a sudden disappeared. There was nothing being passed on to that next generations, which, I mean, that was the devastating effect on our communities. There was no leadership. There was no fathers in the home. And that was something that drew you and I together on this issue is fatherlessness.
And, exactly.
It ran rampant at that time.
Hey everybody, this is Tyler, the podcast manager of Black Like Me. Just wanted to jump on and share 2 quick things about Black Like Me. Number 1, Patreon. Patreon is an opportunity for you if you like our show at all, if you enjoy it, if you want us to keep creating this content, to be able to support us financially and to help us do that. If you're as little as $2 a month, you can join our team. We also have some other higher tiers with some more benefits if you join. So please go to patreon.com/blacklikeme to hear more. Number 2 is that if you are interested in having Dr. G speak, if you're interested in him doing some consulting for you, your organization, anything like that, you can go to alexg.com/contact and you can fill out a form to be able to see how you might be able to bring Dr. G to your business or your community. All right, back to the show.
Right. John, I got a question for you. If you could sit down with, let's just say, every U.S. attorney from the 94 districts are all fired and new ones are appointed, what would you say to them that you wish had been said to you about tough on crime, tough on drugs, incarcerated people? What are things that you would share from your current knowledge through reading, interacting, knowing Jerome, that you would say to these 94 individuals as they embark upon their work?
Thank you so much. That's an excellent question. Part of it, my answer is based on what I did and what I felt for all the years I was a prosecutor. But part of it is based on what I started doing while I was a prosecutor, but what I do now, I basically go all over the world and work with defense attorneys, prosecutors and judges and some police officers on rule of law projects, trying to as best we can have criminal justice systems that work based on the rule of law. And I can tell you, when you're working with Turkish defense attorneys these days who are themselves being arrested when they try and vigorously defend a client, you're talking about some beleaguered souls. So from that experience and my own experience, what I would say to people is really a couple things. First, and this is why my relationship with Jerome, I think, has built upon itself. People say to me, like you just said, gee, how do you go to lunch with a guy you prosecuted? And I would always say to every prosecutor who I hired, whom I worked with, and I would say to them now, you can't do my job. You can't be a prosecutor for any lengthy period of time unless you do it with some empathy. The people at the other table, the defendants, there is a story. Good people do bad things. And I tell prosecutors, that doesn't, and Jerome knows I feel this way, you have to prosecute some people. I mean, people commit crimes.
Right.
But if you want to be a success and you want the respect of the people you're prosecuting, treat them with empathy. Now, Jerome happened to have been a person with a drug problem and a really nice person. And his story, that's why his story resonates when he goes to Oxford, to the prison, because he is the picture. He is the picture of hope. People can change.
Mm-hmm.
His success resonates with them. But I remember looking across the table at Jerome, at the other table, and trying to do it with empathy. So I would tell people that. But that empathy has to continue when people are released, and you will help with reentry as a prosecutor by going and speaking to groups at the Rock Valley Community Corrections, that federal halfway house for people listening in Janesville. There would be groups of 15 or 20 who are finishing their federal sentences, but instead of just being on the street, they get to stay in this community correction center. They go to work, they kind of re-enter. And I would go down there in the evening when they were back from work, and I would sit down, just me, no law enforcement, no police protection, and they would ask questions, and I'd try and answer. And they'd want to know, well, am I going to go right back to prison? I'm like, well, don't screw up, okay? And I try and talk to them about that. But my point was, and I would say this to all the prosecutors, your empathy has to continue from when they sat at the table next to you or across from you to when they're getting out of prison. And that's why I enjoyed my time with Jerome. Our backgrounds are totally different. When he talks about his life in the absence of people, and suddenly what I have a very good Native American friend who refers to it as generational trauma. People in the Native American community, people in the African American community, they suffer today because what happened 100 years ago. This can't be, you can't understand this as a white person in America unless you really think about it. So when Jerome and I talk about it, I think of my growing up in a Rice Lake, a northern Wisconsin town. When I grew up, the only African-American guy I ever ran into, I thought about this morning, Billy Tyler. Billy Tyler played football for Eau Claire North. And when they came to Rice Lake, I'd never seen he probably weighed 200 pounds. But I thought he was the biggest black man I'd ever seen. And so my experience is obviously totally different, but we come from the same point, which is really a position of thinking people, and thinking people will deal with others with empathy, understanding that people have jobs to do, but there's a basic core of empathy. Excuse me.
I think another thing, if I were sort of a co-lecturer with you to those 94 neophytes who are entering their role as U.S. attorneys, I would also say, to the best of your abilities, you need to have cross-cultural relationships. That, in fact, I would make that a requirement, because I'm just thinking even about your thought about Billy Tyler. It's interesting how he seemed bigger than what he really was. But we constantly hear police officers saying, when they're looking at pictures of Black youth, they will assume that a young woman is 3 or 5 years older, that a Black male might be 13, and the assumption might be that he's 18. I think that these folks have to be grounded in humanity, and they've got to find a way to make themselves more engaged, more accessible, and more educated. Because what's happening is, on the back end, we're experiencing all of this disparity, but there's an assumption that U.S. attorneys, district attorneys, mayors, governors, presidents, that they all have this sympathy, this empathy, this connection with humanity, and many people don't. And when push comes to shove, we go to what we know, to what we believe, to what we've learned. Mm-hmm. And we've got to really make cross-cultural relationships, real relationships, a part of the hiring process, because then you don't have that on top of everything else. So you're sharing that, John, was really, really important about what we say to them. But I really think that we've got to understand that racism, as I've come to describe it to people, is not wearing a hood and burning crosses on people's lawns. But I liken it to the clean water acts that we have here in Wisconsin. That we have beautiful lakes that surround Madison, but they're phosphorus and algae ridden. Fish that are hatched, or whatever the process is called, they're hatched or laid, or whatever. Fish in our lakes are born into that sickness, and so they become sick because of no other reason of being born in Lake Monona, Lake Mendota. It didn't do anything wrong. Right. So I want people to understand that racism is not just not liking people who are different than you. It's in your gills. It's in your fins. It's there because it exists in this world. And until we stop having unfair laws, and until we stop over-incarcerating and arresting folks, until we begin to learn how to build more cross-cultural relationships, I think we're going to continue to see disparity in these processes. And so we try to train people out of it. We talk about implicit bias, and I'm for that. We can do all of that. But I think when folks are 6 or 7, we move from not really seeing color to being friends, to then seeing color and being distant. And I don't think the country has realized to what extent the fear of each other, the distance from each other, is influencing interactions, particularly in a place like Wisconsin, where you pick the illness, you pick the issue, you pick the subject: education, economic, property ownership, wealth creation. Black people trail their white counterpart worse than in almost any other state. So that perspective of what you would say to new people is really important. But for the sake of our listeners, your cross-cultural relationships cannot just be client-based. It cannot just be those folks. You've got to be able to really go out of your way and find folks, particularly if you're in public service. Yeah, Jerome?
You raising that, and John leading with that.
Yeah.
Just put me in mind, we have a judge on our panel. Actually, John taught this person, I believe, in college. But we have a judge, and I remember one of our members challenging him after he did a talk at Nehemiah. Right. And he asked him, "How many Black people do you know?" And he said, "Well, I went to school with one in Iowa." And he was challenged that, don't you feel you should get to know some of the people who are coming before you in your court? And the relationship that was built out of there was a clean example of what having those cross-cultural relationships can and will impact both individuals.
In this team we have, it's about 10 people. You and John are there, but then you also have Aaron and Nick. Mm-hmm. And so here's a person who Aaron spent the majority of his adult life incarcerated, or on paper somehow connected with criminal justice systems or processes. These men know each other. They know their wives. I'll hear them at these meetings checking in, like, "Hey man, we got to get together soon." Or, "Hey, what are you doing now? Let's go grab." I went to dinner with them once. They were having dinner together. This guy was formerly incarcerated. Aaron's like now our assistant director of reentry. But they still keep in touch. And for me, seeing Nick and Aaron, watching you and John, gives me a sense of hope for our system. And it's not just on the implicit bias training on the back end, but it's folks getting a chance to think about each other differently. And the information that comes out of those discussions, I think, is tremendously it's powerful. It's tremendously valuable, because no one can, not very many people can have the kinds of discussions that you and John do.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think you two need to talk more about this, because not just prosecutors, but, folks coming out of law school, just looking forward, having you both say, here's what I wish I knew. We're both doing our jobs. Like, taking it out of the personal and realizing that these are systems that are warring, but you two, because you built a rapport with each other, can honestly call out the systemic glitches, which would be really meaningful. So I would say to the two of you, I know you're busy and you do a whole lot of stuff, but you all need to record a talk or something, because what you two have to say today to each other, to the legal community, to the folks who are wrapped up in the traps of mass incarceration is invaluable. And I don't hear people doing what you two can do.
I just want to make one follow-up real quickly, Reverend G. One of the things, the message that I would send to everybody, prosecutors or otherwise, is, you've got to get out. You've got to engage with people. And one of the things I really tried to do when I was U.S. attorney, I thought, I'm not just a prosecutor, I'm the face of the Department of Justice. So I made sure I, met with leadership and others at the NAACP, at the Urban League, Centro Hispano, and then given what's going on in the country, I drove hours and hours, and I went to every mosque in this state. And there's mosques as far north as Barron and Marshfield and Janesville and Eau Claire and so on and so forth. But I would talk to all those people, and I would say, your obligation, whether it's you're black or white or a Muslim or a Jew, your obligation is to engage. Because when you engage, and it just was something that came to me, it's just harder to hate an actual face.
Right.
And I know we know that's true, and it's easy to say, but when you sit down in a meeting at the Gurdwara, I was at the Sikh Gurdwara out in Middleton on the anniversary of the shootings down at Oak Creek, and I'm sitting there with all these Sikhs, and suddenly they're talking and they're laughing, and I share stories about my time in Pakistan and my time in Bangladesh, and when I'm at the mosque. My point is that it wasn't just me wanting to engage. I needed them to engage, and I would encourage them to. If their schools need something about their religion, volunteer, go down there and speak. Because when we engage with people, we just don't hate as much.
You're right. Hey, my last question, John, I'm going to ask you, and then Drum, I'm going to let you have the last word. But
John,
he
always gets the last word.
He always does. No, he may beg to differ, John.
That's okay. That's true.
You first interacted with Jerome in 87.
Mm-hmm.
And how has criminal justice taken a step forward or backwards or sideways since the time you both have interacted? How have we moved? Where are we going since 87 when Jerome first stood in front of you? And then Jerome, I'm going to ask you the same questions. You can begin thinking about that.
I'll give everybody a 1 minute swing of the pendulum, because that's what criminal justice is.
Sure.
Prior to Jerome coming into the prison system in 1987, when I started, there was a parole commission. If you got sentenced, you did about a third of your time, perhaps. You got out. It was a rehabilitation model, at least in theory. I'm not saying it worked perfectly, but that was the idea. The pendulum swung. Jerome gets caught up on toughened crime. 1984, we start saying, no, wait, we're going to arrest you. You're not going to get out on bail. We're going to hold people without bail until they're tried. And then, as Jerome's already said, from 1987 to 2005, we have mandatory sentences, not just mandatory minimums, what the judge has to sentence you to, but these, what were called guidelines, which weren't guidelines at all. They were decided. The judge had to follow them. There was no discretion. They were very long sentences, and they did not have any possibility of parole. You didn't get out until you'd done 85% of your sentence if you were good in prison. If you were good. Mm-hmm. Don't screw up inside. If you're good and follow the rules. So the pendulum swings. And that stays in place until, as we were discussing earlier, a case I tried in 2005, you can look it up, the Supreme Court case, United States versus Freddie Booker, small-time crack dealer from Beloit. with a bad criminal record. He was a pretty violent guy. Sells a small amount of crack, about 16 grams, as I recall, and he gets 30 years in prison. That case goes to the Supreme Court. These guidelines are thrown out as being unconstitutional after all those years. Now they're advisory, so the pendulum swings, and judges now, federal judges, are allowed to sentence as they see fit, using the guidelines more as a guide. Under President Obama, just to wrap up, the pendulum swings. He decides we've got to do something about all those people Jerome has been seeing in prison. And he tries to work on a clemency project where he will commute sentences of people sentenced 20 years ago who've done enough time. And I'll never forget it. Your listeners, I want them to imagine this. I'm in the West Wing of the White House with 92 other U.S. attorneys. The most powerful man on the face of the earth, President Obama, walks down to the West Wing, and he's always talking and joshing, thanking us. But he wants to talk about the Clemency Project, and I've never heard him more serious. He says, we are going to do this. We're going to get these people out of prison, and you are going to help. We're prosecutors. He's telling us we're going to help get people out of prison. So the pendulum swings, and we do. A fair number of people get clemency. I wish I had the numbers at the top of my head, but you can find them. Under President Obama's direction, we stopped imposing those severe mandatory minimums on 5 years. 5 years in prison for like 5 grams of crack, as I recall. We stopped imposing them even though they still existed. Okay? Elections have consequences. The pendulum swings. As the policy now is to impose those mandatory minimums. We supposedly have this horrible crime problem, which in fact statistically isn't accurate. The crime problem is decreased. So my point is, Jerome gets caught right at the beginning of a very, very heavy swing in the pendulum. I see it move to clemency, to reentry, to try and use the prosecutor's office to prosecute, but with empathy. And now, of course, I believe it has swung back, as is a good example in our own state with the recent "get tough on crime" laws.
Right.
When in fact you're doing it for purely political reasons.
Right.
So you can say I'm tough on crime when in fact that's not even necessary. That's where we are.
No, that's a good history lesson, man.
Wow.
You, Jerome, from the time you appeared before John in '87 to now, what strides have we made in criminal justice, or have we moved backwards, in your opinion?
Well, I think around the country there have been some really, really good strides in reform, but the state of Wisconsin has been immune to any reform over the last 10 years or so. And
is that before Walker?
Well, there was some attempts before Walker in 2011 when Walker came in.
Okay.
Governor Dole came up with Act 28 to counter truth in sentencing in the state. Also, there were other ways of earning your way out or earning your way out of prison. But the fact is, the Council of State Government came around did an evaluation of 50 states' criminal justice systems and came in with recommendations. The crime bill, the 94 crime bill, catastrophically shot up the prison population, prison building, incentives to pass laws like truth in sentencing, 3 strikes, and
whose bill was that in '94? Who?
That was the crime bill that Bill Clinton.
That's what I want you to say.
Federal law.
Yep. And the incentives, a lot of states chased the dollars. There was $26.5 billion invested in criminal justice, tough on crime, criminal justice acts.
Did those dollars help to build prisons?
Build law enforcement, to hire more police, military equipment for the war on drugs, to build prisons. In the state of Wisconsin, between '94 and 2004, we built 9 prisons
9.
and bought one. So in a 10-year span, there were 10 prisons, new prisons that just popped up in Wisconsin. And they have a saying, if you build it, you will fill it. And so, we had empty prisons here while we had prisoners out of state. So getting back to your question, it's kind of hard for me to talk with this.
No, I know. Are you hopeful? Do you think we're moving in a good direction that makes your heart feel good? Or are you afraid?
I am not hopeful in this day and time. Not at all. Not what's going on in this state. So many states have surpassed us, but still, in the state of Iowa, you can get a felony conviction. You lose your voting rights for life.
For life.
For life. There's still a few states that did it, that does that. Florida was one, Louisiana, a lot of the southern states, Kentucky, they got away from it. And then there was, I believe it was Virginia. And then there was an act after the governor lost the election. They went back to that disenfranchisement of felony disenfranchisement for life for individuals who have felony convictions. So it's glim. It really is.
But aren't places like Michigan closing prisons?
Yes. Thank you for bringing that point up. I do recall Michigan being very compatible to Wisconsin and how they did revocations, how they did earn release, truth in sentencing. But they've made some changes that that caused them to be able to close a few prisons. Texas has led the way in closing facilities, and that's
Texas.
But there's justice reinvestment. That's the route. That's the direction I would love to see Wisconsin go in, to reinvest dollars back into the communities where these individuals are returning to or where they're coming from. Mm-hmm. That's how they were able to do it in Texas and many other states by reinvesting half the savings into the communities where these individuals are coming from.
Sure. And last question, Mr. Dillard. Tell me something major that Expo is a part of that you're really excited about and proud of. Just give people a sense of what you're looking at right now, because I really want people to click the link in this podcast to follow your work. But is there anything that you're currently working on, recently worked on, that just to give people a kind of sense of the type of reform that you're working on? If you could just give us like a 10 or 15 second example of something.
Okay. Well, we've been at it for a while. The Ban the Box campaign is something that we were successful in getting done in different cities and counties around the state. Right now, Unlock the Vote, which is restoring the voting rights of individuals once they're back in our communities.
Sure.
They're paying taxes, they're working, they're taking care of their families. They should be able to vote. Taxation without representation is real. And I feel that that's the current campaign that we're doing. We had some legislation introduced, but it did not get out of committee for a hearing because of the makeup of the committees and who's running them. But that's what we're embarked on now: unlocking the vote, restoring voting rights for individuals once they're back in the community.
Got you. And just one question for clarification. In states like Iowa, you mentioned if men and women have a felony conviction, they cannot vote. But is it true that folks who are incarcerated are counted inside the census?
Very, very valid point that you just brought up. Yes. And that's pretty much throughout the country. But I know that in Wisconsin, they're counted as residents of the communities where they're housed.
So we can get dollars.
Waupun, it triples their population because they have 3-4 prisons within that, whether it's 4 or 5 in Dodge County, but in the city of Waupun itself, you have 3 prisons right there. Dodge is one of the larger facilities. Fox Lake and no, Fox Lake is in Fox Lake. I'm sorry. Buckeye Correctional, Dodge, and the Burke Center, all in one city.
So they're counted in order to get us more federal dollars, but those individuals are not allowed. In some states, they're not allowed to vote, even once they're off paper. Again, you know, it's a strong sentence, a phrase I hear you say, taxation without representation.
Mm-hmm.
It's wild. Listen, gentlemen, I have enjoyed talking with you so much, and please know I'd like to bring you all back at some point. You know, as rules change, actions change. I want to talk about just your perspective from a prosecutor and from formerly incarcerated individual about how you see things that are happening. I'd love to have a discussion with you all at some point down the road to see how COVID-19 and its impact on those who are incarcerated is playing out. And not just talking about how we address the issue, but the pre-existing issues, and I don't mean medical, the pre-existing issues that touch upon social determinants of health, disenfranchisement, racism that has really led up to this. And so at some point, I just love to talk with you all. But listen, thank you so much for being my guest. My guests have been Mr. Jerome Dillard, founder and executive director of Expo, ex-incarcerated people organizing, and Mr. John Vaudreuil, former U.S. attorney for the Western District of Wisconsin. You both have just opened my eyes to so many things, and I appreciate your rapport, your candor, and I appreciate the fact that we can be here together and there's no court cases pending. Jerome, you are a representation, sterling representation that people can change and do, and you give back. And Mr. Vaudreuil, you're a sterling example about how prosecutors can see people with empathy and then build relationships with them and see them with empathy and respect. Because I think we can feel for people without necessarily respecting them. And I think the rapport you have with Mr. Dillard shows that it is important for folks in your role or legal fields to not only be empathetic, but very respectful. And that happens through a meaningful, mutually beneficial relationship. And so listen, folks, as always, I keep promising you that we bring excellent program to Black Like Me. But listen, you know someone who has been formerly incarcerated, someone who works for law enforcement, someone who's an attorney. You need to share this episode. You can tweet the link out. You can post it on Instagram, talk about it, share. But let's get this word out. These are the kinds of stories that we don't get to hear. The humanization of not only formerly incarcerated men and women, but the humanization of federal prosecutors. And we need to begin to think like humans, interacting like our lives matter. Nothing else. COVID-19 has shown us that we are way more connected to the world and each other than we have been willing to give credence to. So share this message, because unless people think differently, they won't vote differently. And if people don't understand that there can be change, that we have other options than being tough on crime, we will continue to elect and re-elect folks who are jacking our systems, our country, and our families up. So as always, Black Like Me listeners, I challenge you to listen, lean in, learn, experience personal transformation, then become the kind of change that you want to see in the community. I'm your host, Dr. Alex G., and it is my pleasure to be able to bring this to you. And listen, subscribe. I know people are listening, they're sharing, but take a moment to subscribe, because every week you'll get an email letting you know that a new episode is in your box. And please take a moment to just click the Patreon link. We have new Patreon folks that are coming in almost weekly now, and there's content, I call it Dr. G Raw, but there's content that I share directly right to those listeners, and only those folks hear it. And sometimes it's even a video. But there are things that I want to communicate that just happen spur of the moment, and I can't wait until my next recording date. So please take a moment to become an insider, to become a supporter of this, so that we can continue to get this good message out. Thank you all so much. Please, by all means, be safe. Listen to the guidelines of your community regarding social distancing, because we need you. We need you, because we've got to all work together to clean this big mess up. All right? Take care and have a great day.
Ooh, black like me, yeah. Ooh,
I want to thank Corey Saffold for creating the music for this podcast, my podcast manager, Tyler Nyland, engineer and editor, Eli Steenlich, my editor, Jeremy Holiday, and a special thank you to WORT Studios, where we record Black Like Me.
Ooh, Black Like Me.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. You can find out more about Dr. Alex G's amazing work at www.alexg.com. Black Like Me is sponsored by the generosity of the Human Family Unity Foundation.